This story is inspired by the kind of tragedy that rarely makes headlines for long, not because it lacks importance, but because it unfolds quietly, among people the world often forgets. There are no heroes in uniforms, no villains announcing themselves loudly, no spectacle meant to shock. What remains instead are ordinary lives, shared routines, and a community that believed it had found a safe place to grow old together. Everything you are about to hear is told with respect. The focus is not on violence, but on the human cost of broken trust, unspoken tensions, and small moral failures that, when ignored, can reshape an entire town. This is a story about belonging, loneliness, and the fragile spaces where people feel seen until they don't. This is the fatal bingo night. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. In 1985, Lexington, Kentucky still held on to a kind of quiet that was slowly disappearing from the rest of the country. The city was not small, but certain neighborhoods moved at a gentler pace, shaped by routine and memory rather than urgency. Streets emptied early in the evening. Porch lights flickered on one by one. Radios murmured behind closed curtains. Winter pressed softly against everything, not cruel, just constant. For many elderly residents, the cold months carried a particular weight. Days blended together. Appointments replaced adventures. Conversations became shorter, less frequent. The world felt like it was moving forward without checking who had been left behind. Except on Thursday nights. Behind a modest church on the edge of a residential block stood a community hall that most people barely noticed. Its brick walls were worn, the paint on its door chipped from years of use. There was nothing remarkable about it, unless you knew what happened inside. On Thursdays it became a lifeline. Cars arrived early, parking carefully, headlights cutting briefly through the dark before fading. People stepped out slowly, coats pulled tight, breaths visible in the cold air. Some walked alone, others came in pairs. A few arrived already talking, eager to fill the silence they had carried all day. Inside, the hall smelled of coffee, old paper, and something faintly sweet. Maybe powdered creamer, maybe memory. Folding tables were arranged neatly, metal chairs scraped softly against the floor. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, unforgiving but familiar. This was bingo night. For the people who gathered there, bingo was not a game of chance. It was a structure, a promise, a reason to be expected somewhere. Martha Caldwell arrived just after 6, as she always did. She paused at the entrance, adjusting her scarf, steadying herself before stepping fully inside. At 78, she had learned to measure her movements carefully. Pride kept her from asking for help. Habit kept her coming back. She smiled at the volunteer collecting fees, exchanged a few kind words, and made her way to her usual seat, third table from the front, near the aisle. She liked being able to see everyone. Faces grounded her. Watching others laugh, frown, concentrate, it reminded her that she was still part of something. Her husband had been gone for 8 years, her sister for 5. Her children called when they could, but their lives were full. The hall didn't replace what she had lost, but it softened the absence. Across the room, Harold Bennett's voice rose above the others. He laughed loudly, deliberately, leaning back in his chair as if space itself belonged to him. Once he had supervised dozens of workers in a manufacturing plant. People had listened when he spoke. Retirement had taken that from him quietly, without ceremony. Bingo nights gave him back an audience. He joked, teased, commented on the weather, the coffee, the numbers. Some laughed genuinely. Others smiled politely. Harold didn't notice the difference, or pretended not to. Near the back, Evelyn and Ruth Moore settled into their chairs side by side. Sisters by birth, companions by necessity. They had learned to share silence without discomfort. Ruth placed her purse under the table. Evelyn folded her coat neatly over the chair. Small rituals that made the world feel predictable. Around them sat others with similar stories. Widows, widowers, men whose children lived far away, women whose days were filled with television and quiet kitchens. Here, names mattered. Absences were noticed. At the front of the room stood Daniel Price, preparing for the evening. He checked the microphone, straightened the stack of cards, glanced at the clock. He had volunteered for years, long enough to become part of the routine. People trusted him because he had always been there, because nothing had ever gone wrong. "All right, folks," he said, tapping the mic gently. "Let's get started." The room responded with a soft wave of attention. Conversations faded. Cards were lifted. Chips were arranged carefully, some stacked by color, some scattered without pattern. Each arrangement reflected a lifetime of habits. The first numbers were called. Voices repeated them under breath. Chips clicked softly against cardboard. The room settled into focus. For a while it felt peaceful. Martha marked her cards slowly, savoring the rhythm. Harold leaned forward, suddenly serious. Evelyn watched Ruth's hands move with practiced ease. Daniel's voice carried steadily across the room. But beneath the calm, something subtle began to shift. It wasn't a mistake. Not yet. It was a feeling. A hesitation before a number was called, a glance exchanged between two players, a pause that lingered just long enough to be noticed but not questioned. Martha felt it as a tightening in her chest. Harold felt it when no one responded to a joke he thought deserved laughter. Evelyn felt Ruth's hand still, her knitting forgotten. No one said anything. They continued playing. Wins were announced. Applause followed, quieter than usual but present. Coffee was poured. Chairs creaked. Still, the atmosphere had changed. The trust that filled the room was not gone, but it had thinned, like ice forming beneath still water. As the night drew on, people became more attentive, not excited, watchful. Eyes followed Daniel's movements. Cards were checked twice, then again. By the end of the evening, the joy that usually lingered was absent. Coats were gathered quickly. Goodbyes were shorter, uncertain. The cold outside felt sharper than when they had arrived. Martha paused by her car, staring at the hall for a moment longer than usual. Harold lingered near the door, his confidence dimmed. Evelyn and Ruth walked to their vehicle without speaking. None of them could explain what felt wrong. None of them knew that this quiet unease, unnoticed, unaddressed, was the beginning of something that would change Lexington forever. Because sometimes tragedy doesn't announce itself loudly. Sometimes it begins with silence. The days following that Thursday night unfolded with an unfamiliar weight. Lexington did not wake up to headlines or sirens. There were no official statements, no urgent calls for attention. Instead, something quieter settled over the city, a shared unease that moved slowly from one conversation to the next, carried in pauses, glances, and half-finished sentences. For the people who had been in the hall, the night refused to stay contained. Martha Caldwell found herself replaying small moments she had barely noticed before, the way Daniel's voice had faltered, the way people had stopped smiling without realizing it. She sat at her kitchen table each morning with a cup of coffee she rarely finished, staring at the window, as if answers might appear outside. Her house felt larger than usual, the silence heavier. She told herself it was nothing, that people her age worried too much. But the feeling lingered. Across town, Harold Bennett paced his living room, irritation replacing his usual bravado. He had spent most of his life believing that systems worked because people made them work. The idea that something dishonest could slip into a place built on trust gnawed at him. It wasn't the accusation itself that bothered him. It was how quickly it had been dismissed. He thought of Clara's voice, calm, certain. That certainty unsettled him. Evelyn and Ruth Moore spoke less than usual in the days that followed. They moved through their routines side by side, but something fragile had shifted between them. Ruth, normally the quieter of the two, became restless, rearranging drawers, double-checking locks, folding and refolding laundry that didn't need it. "It was just a game," Evelyn said once gently. Ruth didn't answer. Word spread the way it always does in places where people pay attention to each other, at the pharmacy, at the grocery store, after church on Sunday morning. No one raised their voice. No one accused anyone outright. The story grew not through exaggeration, but through repetition. Someone mentioned a number being called twice. Someone else said they had noticed inconsistencies before. Another admitted they had stopped coming months ago because something felt off. Individually, none of it meant much. Together, it formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Daniel Price felt the shift immediately. He noticed it in the way people looked at him when he ran into them around town. Their greetings were still polite but shorter, their smiles less assured. He reassured himself that he had done nothing wrong, that mistakes happen, that memories blur. Still, he avoided the hall for several days. When he finally returned to prepare for the next bingo night, the building felt different, emptier, colder. He walked through the room slowly, touching the backs of chairs, adjusting tables that didn't need adjusting. The silence pressed against him. That Thursday, attendance dropped. Some seats remained empty, chairs that had been occupied for years by the same people, now untouched. The absence spoke louder than any accusation. Those who did come arrived cautiously, conversations muted, laughter restrained. Martha took her usual seat, but she sat more rigidly, her eyes alert. Harold arrived later than usual, his jokes subdued. Evelyn and Ruth sat together, their cards untouched longer than necessary. Daniel greeted everyone with extra warmth, as if kindness alone could mend what had frayed. He spoke more carefully, repeated numbers with deliberate clarity, showed each ball openly before calling it. It helped, but not enough. Trust, once shaken, does not return quickly. As the evening progressed, the tension remained unspoken yet ever present. People checked each other's cards. They whispered. They hesitated before marking numbers. The joy that once filled the room had been replaced by vigilance. No one accused Daniel directly. No one demanded answers, but the damage deepened anyway. After that night, small changes became permanent ones. A few regulars stopped coming altogether. Others attended sporadically as if unsure whether they belonged anymore. The hall, once a refuge from loneliness, now mirrored it. Martha noticed how empty her table felt. Harold noticed how quiet the room had become. Evelyn noticed Ruth watching the door more than the caller. Outside the hall, the emotional impact spread further. Families began asking questions. Children worried about parents who depended on the bingo night for connection. Church leaders quietly discussed whether something should be done. No one wanted conflict. Everyone wanted reassurance. But reassurance requires clarity, and clarity never came. Instead, something else took root. Resentment. Not anger that explodes, but the kind that simmers. The kind that grows when people feel dismissed, unheard, insignificant. For those who had already lost so much, independence, companionship, purpose, the idea that their last safe space might have betrayed them cut deeply. They began to talk less about bingo and more about fairness, about dignity, about how easy it is to overlook the elderly. By early spring, the hall stood half empty most Thursdays. Daniel suggested changes, new procedures, outside oversight, transparency. But his efforts felt late, reactive. The trust that had once been automatic now required proof, and even proof felt insufficient. Martha skipped a night for the first time in years. Harold left early one evening without explanation. Evelyn and Ruth argued quietly at home, their shared world suddenly fragile. None of them knew how to name what they were feeling. They only knew that something precious had cracked. And when fragile communities fracture, the consequences rarely arrive all at once. They arrive slowly, invisibly, carried by isolation, unresolved doubts, and the dangerous belief that silence is safer than confrontation. Lexington was still quiet, but beneath that quiet, something was building. Spring arrived in Lexington without celebration. The cold loosened its grip, but the heaviness that had settled over the community hall did not lift with the weather. If anything, the changing season made the contrast sharper. Outside, trees began to bloom, neighbors reopened their windows, and life appeared to move forward. Inside the routines of those who once depended on bingo night, something remained deeply unsettled. For Martha Caldwell, the days grew longer in an uncomfortable way. She woke earlier than usual, her body restless, her thoughts circling the same unanswered questions. The kitchen clock ticked louder than it ever had. She found herself standing by the window, watching cars pass, wondering which of the familiar faces inside them no longer felt welcome in the hall. She told herself she would return next Thursday. Then she didn't. The absence surprised her more than anyone else. Skipping bingo was unthinkable. It had structured her week for years, but now the idea of sitting in that room, of marking numbers while suspicion hovered in the air, felt heavier than staying home alone. Loneliness, she discovered, could feel safer than disappointment. Across town, Harold Bennett's frustration hardened into something sharper. What had begun as irritation turned into fixation. He replayed conversations in his mind, imagined how things should have been handled, how respect should have been restored. He talked about it endlessly, to neighbors, to relatives, to anyone who would listen. They just brushed it off, he said again and again, like it didn't matter. The words carried more than anger. They carried fear. Fear that once people reached a certain age, their concerns became invisible. Evelyn and Ruth Moore felt the fracture in quieter ways. Their shared routines began to fray. Ruth grew increasingly vigilant, convinced that the situation at the hall was a symptom of something larger. Evelyn, ever the peacemaker, urged patience, believing that time would soften the edges. "You can't live expecting betrayal," she said gently. Ruth didn't disagree, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they already had. Attendance at the hall continued to decline. Those who still came sat farther apart. Conversations stayed on safe topics: weather, church announcements, grandchildren. The deeper connections that once filled the room, shared memories, private jokes, unspoken understanding, had faded. Daniel Price tried to regain control, but every effort reminded him how much had slipped away. He introduced new rules, slowed the pace of the game, displayed each number carefully. His voice became measured, almost cautious, as if he were walking across thin ice. He felt watched, not with hostility, but with disappointment. A far more difficult gaze to endure. What hurt most was the silence. No one confronted him directly. No one demanded explanations. The accusations lived in the air, unspoken yet unmistakable. He began to dread Thursday nights, the very thing he once volunteered for with pride. Outside the hall, concern deepened. Family members noticed changes. Elderly parents who once looked forward to bingo now avoided it. Some stopped leaving the house altogether. Social workers quietly flagged the growing isolation. Church leaders debated intervention, unsure how to step into something so delicate. The hall, once a refuge, had become a reminder of fragility. Then came the meeting. A small group gathered one afternoon in a side room of the church. Not formally announced, not widely attended. Just a handful of regulars, along with a community coordinator. The goal was reassurance, healing, transparency. Instead, it exposed how deep the wounds had become. Voices remained calm, but words cut carefully. People spoke of feeling dismissed, of years of loyalty suddenly meaning nothing. Some admitted they had stopped trusting not just the game, but the space itself. Daniel listened, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He explained procedures. He apologized for any confusion. He promised oversight. It wasn't enough. Trust, they realized, could not be restored through explanation alone. It required acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement felt incomplete. After the meeting, the hall felt emptier than ever. Martha returned once, sitting quietly, her card untouched for several minutes. She watched people rather than the numbers. She noticed how tired everyone looked, how guarded. She left early, her heart heavy. Harold stopped coming entirely. Evelyn and Ruth continued, but the comfort was gone. Ruth flinched at every pause in the calling. Evelyn felt the joy drain from something that once anchored her, and beneath all of it, something darker began to take shape. Not violence, not chaos. Resentment layered atop isolation. Fear compounded by pride. The quiet despair of people who believed they had been wronged and would never be heard. In communities like this, where lives are lived slowly and routines carry meaning, the erosion of trust does not simply disappoint, it destabilizes. By early summer, the hall stood mostly quiet on Thursday nights. And in that quiet, people sat alone in their homes, replaying grievances, nurturing unspoken anger, convincing themselves that silence was dignity. They did not see how dangerous that belief could become, because when people lose their last place of belonging, when they feel unseen and unheard, the damage does not remain contained. It spreads inward. and Lexington was approaching a moment where the weight of that damage could no longer be ignored. By the time summer settled fully over Lexington, the community no longer spoke openly about bingo night, but it lingered everywhere. It surfaced in pauses during conversations, in cautious looks exchanged between neighbors, in the way people corrected themselves mid-sentence, choosing silence over discomfort. The hall behind the church still stood, its door unlocked on Thursdays, its lights still switched on out of habit, but its presence had changed. It was no longer a gathering place, it was a reminder. For many of the elderly residents, the loss of that space felt disproportionate to outsiders. To anyone looking in, it had only been a game, a weekly distraction, something replaceable. But for those who had built their routines around it, bingo had been the last thread tying them to something communal, something predictable, something that affirmed they were still part of the world. Martha Caldwell felt that loss deeply. Her days began to collapse inward. Without Thursday night anchoring her week, time became indistinct. She forgot what day it was more often. Meals lost structure. She left the television on for noise, though she rarely watched it. Sometimes she dressed as if she were going somewhere, only to sit back down unsure of what she had planned. The loneliness was not sudden. It was cumulative. She tried filling the space with phone calls, but conversations felt forced. Her children worried, but from a distance. They suggested activities, senior centers, alternatives. None of them understood that what she missed was not activity, but familiarity. Faces she had known for years, rituals that did not require explanation. Harold Bennett reacted differently. Where Martha withdrew, Harold hardened. He spent his afternoons driving aimlessly, his thoughts circling grievances that no longer had an outlet. He felt humiliated, not by the suspected wrongdoing itself, but by how quickly people like him had been dismissed. He spoke bitterly about respect, about fairness, about how easily trust was broken when no one believed you mattered. Friends stopped engaging. Conversations became tense. Harold interpreted their discomfort as further proof that silence had replaced accountability. Evelyn and Ruth Moore lived with the tension daily. Ruth's anxiety deepened into vigilance. She double-checked doors. She avoided social spaces. She spoke often about how people were taken advantage of when they were seen as harmless. Evelyn worried not just about the hall, but about her sister's growing sense of threat, a feeling that the world had become fundamentally unsafe. "You can't protect yourself from everything," Evelyn said gently one night. Ruth replied, "No, but you can stop pretending nothing happened." Their words hung between them, unresolved. Daniel Price, meanwhile, carried a different weight. He had not returned to the hall in weeks. He avoided familiar streets. He shopped outside his usual hours. The polite distance people kept from him felt worse than open accusation. He replayed every decision, every pause, every response he had given that night. He questioned his own memory, his own intentions. Had he been careless? Had he been defensive when he should have listened? The guilt did not come from proof of wrongdoing, but from uncertainty, and from realizing that trust, once lost, could not be argued back into existence. The hall's decline had consequences beyond emotion. Community leaders grew concerned. Isolation among seniors increased. Missed appointments became more common. Small accidents went unnoticed longer. Church volunteers reported that people who once relied on bingo night had begun to retreat entirely from social life. A meeting was finally proposed, a larger one this time. Not just about bingo, but about the well-being of the elderly residents affected by its collapse. Attendance was uneven. Some came hopeful, others came guarded. Many stayed home, convinced that speaking would change nothing. Those who gathered sat farther apart than they once had. The room echoed differently now, emptier, colder. People spoke of loss, not dramatic loss, but erosion, of confidence, of routine, of connection. Martha spoke quietly, her voice steady but thin. She talked about how the hall had been the last place she felt expected. Harold spoke with controlled anger, emphasizing respect and accountability. Ruth spoke about vulnerability, about how easily older people were dismissed as confused or unreliable. No one shouted, but the emotional weight in the room was immense. The meeting ended without resolution. Plans were suggested, Committees proposed, oversight promised, but what was missing was something far more difficult to restore: belief. Afterward, people left slowly, as if unsure whether they would ever sit together like this again. As summer wore on, the hall stood mostly empty. On one particularly warm Thursday evening, only a handful of chairs were occupied. The air felt stagnant. The numbers were called, but no one celebrated wins. The game ended early. Outside, the sky darkened quietly. Martha stood in the parking lot longer than necessary, listening to the cicadas, feeling the weight of time pressing against her. Harold sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. Evelyn and Ruth walked slowly, neither speaking. Something was slipping further out of reach. Not just bingo, but trust in one another, in institutions, in the idea that speaking up still mattered. And when people begin to believe that their voices no longer carry weight, when isolation deepens and resentment is left unaddressed, the consequences rarely remain emotional alone. Lexington had not reached that point yet, but it was moving closer, quietly, relentlessly. By late summer, the damage was no longer subtle. It showed in small, undeniable ways: missed medications, unanswered phone calls, unopened mail stacking near front doors. It showed in routines abandoned and habits distorted. The quiet that had once felt peaceful in Lexington now carried a different quality, one that pressed inward rather than soothed. For the elderly who had relied on the bingo hall, the collapse of that space had removed more than a weekly gathering. It had dismantled a system of mutual observation, the unspoken safety net where absences were noticed, moods were read, and decline was gently caught before it became dangerous. Now people disappeared quietly. Martha Caldwell's days blurred together completely. She woke before sunrise most mornings, disoriented, unsure whether she had slept at all. Her kitchen calendar still had bingo written in careful handwriting on Thursdays, a habit she hadn't broken even months later. She stared at it often, tracing the letters with her eyes, feeling a dull ache behind her ribs. She stopped cooking full meals. Food lost meaning when no one commented on it, when no one shared the table. She lived on toast, soup, whatever required the least effort. Her house felt colder, though the weather was warm. She wore sweaters inside, seeking comfort from pressure rather than temperature. Neighbors noticed but hesitated. Everyone assumed someone else would check on her. Harold Bennett spiraled in the opposite direction. His isolation fed his anger, and his anger fed his sense of purpose. Without bingo night, he lacked an outlet, and so his thoughts turned inward, looping endlessly. He wrote letters he never sent. He drafted complaints to institutions that never replied. He replayed imagined conversations, always ending them with words he wished he had said. At night, sleep abandoned him. He paced his living room, television flickering silently, convinced that the injustice he felt was not just personal, but symbolic, proof that people like him had become disposable. That belief hardened him. Evelyn and Ruth Moore felt the strain physically. Ruth's vigilance transformed into near-constant anxiety. She insisted on accompanying Evelyn everywhere. She flinched at unexpected sounds. Her trust in public spaces eroded rapidly. Evelyn, meanwhile, grew exhausted, trying to stabilize a world that felt increasingly fragile. Their apartment, once a place of shared calm, became tense. "Oh, you're shrinking your life," Evelyn said one evening, her voice tired rather than accusatory. "I'm protecting it," Ruth replied. Neither knew how to bridge the gap. Daniel Price withdrew almost entirely from public life. He avoided church. He avoided the grocery store during peak hours. He felt watched even when alone. The ambiguity surrounding the accusation gnawed at him relentlessly. He questioned his memories, his motives, his integrity. Without confrontation, without resolution, guilt became a constant companion. He stopped volunteering altogether. The hall, now mostly unused, stood as a monument to failure. Community workers began to notice patterns they couldn't ignore. Reports came in quietly. Seniors missing appointments, increased emergency calls, family members expressing concern over sudden withdrawal. The collapse of the bingo night had created a vacuum, one that social services were not equipped to fill quickly. Meetings were held, reports written, solutions proposed, but bureaucracy moved slowly, and loneliness did not wait. As fall approached, the emotional pressure reached a breaking point. People who had once found reassurance in routine now carried resentment, fear, and shame. They blamed themselves for not speaking sooner. They blamed others for speaking at all. They blamed the hall, the caller, the system. Most of all, they blamed the silence. Martha experienced moments of confusion that frightened her. She forgot appointments. She misplaced objects and accused herself harshly. Once, she stood in her hallway, unable to remember why she was there. She did not tell anyone. Harold's anger sharpened into fixation. He began showing up unannounced at meetings, demanding answers no one could give. His tone alarmed people, pushing them further away. Each rejection confirmed his belief that he was being dismissed because of his age. Evelyn noticed Ruth's hands shaking more often. Ruth noticed Evelyn growing quieter, less patient. And still, no one reassembled the community that had once existed. The hall remained empty most nights. Then came the week that everything tilted. A rumor circulated, vague, imprecise, but powerful. Someone said proof existed. Someone said the truth had been buried. Someone said the hall had never been meant to reopen because acknowledging the mistake would expose something larger. The rumor was inconsistent, unreliable, impossible to verify. But it didn't need to be true, it only needed to confirm what people already feared. The effect was immediate. Old wounds reopened. Conversations reignited. Anger found direction. People began talking again, not to heal but to validate their pain. Harold latched onto it instantly. "This is what I've been saying," he told anyone who would listen. They knew. They always knew. Martha overheard fragments of it at the pharmacy, her chest tightening. Ruth heard it from a neighbor and didn't sleep that night. Daniel heard it last. When he did, the weight of it nearly crushed him. The idea that people believed not just that a mistake had been made, but that it had been concealed, shattered what little remained of his emotional stability. He considered confronting it publicly, then decided against it. Fear won, and fear, left unchallenged, multiplies. By the time October arrived, Lexington felt different. Not louder, not chaotic, just tense. People watched each other. Conversations were cautious. The elderly, once visible in small clusters, now moved alone or not at all. The hall behind the church stood locked more often than not. And inside the lives of those who had depended on it, something dangerous had taken root. The belief that dignity had been stolen, that silence was proof of guilt, and that no one was coming to make things right. This was no longer about bingo. It was about meaning. And when people lose meaning, when their final sense of belonging collapses, the consequences do not arrive gently. They arrive because something inside finally gives way. Lexington was approaching that moment, and no one was prepared for what would follow. By November, Lexington no longer felt like a place moving forward. It felt like a place holding its breath. The tension that had once lived quietly beneath routines now seeped into daily life. It was present in the way people lingered before answering simple questions, in how conversations ended abruptly when certain names were mentioned, in the heaviness that settled into rooms even when nothing was being said. The city still functioned, but something essential had stalled. For the elderly who had once filled the community hall, time became an adversary. Days no longer had edges. Without the rhythm of shared routines, hours stretched and collapsed unpredictably. Morning bled into afternoon. Evening arrived without warning. The sense of continuity that once anchored them to the week had dissolved, leaving behind a disorienting sameness. Martha Caldwell felt that erosion most acutely at night. Sleep came in fragments. She woke repeatedly, unsure of what had pulled her from rest. Sometimes it was a sound outside. Sometimes it was nothing at all. Her thoughts circled relentlessly, returning again and again to the hall, to faces she hadn't seen in weeks, to conversations that had ended without closure. She began writing notes to herself, reminders to take medication, to eat, to call someone. The notes accumulated on her kitchen counter, overlapping, contradicting one another. She grew embarrassed by them, as if they were evidence of something she was losing, yet she told no one. Admitting vulnerability felt dangerous in a world where trust had already failed her. Harold Bennett, meanwhile, crossed a different threshold. What had once been anger sharpened into conviction. He no longer questioned whether something wrong had happened. He knew it had. The uncertainty that paralyzed others energized him. He spoke with increasing certainty, recounting events as if they were facts rather than impressions. His tone left little room for doubt. To Harold, doubt was weakness. He gathered fragments of stories, inconsistencies, half-remembered comments, weaving them into a narrative that made sense to him. The story gave him purpose. It gave his frustration direction. Without it, he would have been forced to confront something far more frightening, the possibility that the harm he felt had no clear villain. That possibility was unbearable. Evelyn and Ruth Moore existed in a state of constant vigilance. Ruth's anxiety intensified into something that bordered on panic. She monitored the news obsessively, interpreted neutral events as signs of threat, avoided public spaces altogether. Evelyn tried to ground her, reminding her of what they could control: meals, walks, routines, but the effort drained her. Their relationship, once built on mutual support, strained under the weight of constant fear. "You can't live like this," Evelyn said one evening, her voice breaking under exhaustion. Ruth looked at her, eyes wide and unblinking. "We don't get to choose the world we live in anymore." Daniel Price lived almost entirely inside his own head. He replayed the night again and again, examining each movement, each pause, each decision. The absence of a clear accusation became its own form of punishment. Without confrontation, guilt festered unchecked. He wondered if silence made him complicit, even if he had done nothing intentionally wrong. He drafted statements he never released, apologies he never delivered, explanations that sounded hollow even to himself. The hall remained closed most nights. When it did open, only a handful of people came. The games felt mechanical, drained of warmth. No one stayed afterward. The building emptied quickly, as if everyone feared lingering too long in a place that had become symbolic of failure. Outside the hall, the broader consequences grew harder to ignore. Emergency responders noticed an increase in calls involving elderly residents, confusion, minor accidents, moments of panic that escalated because no one was nearby to notice sooner. Social workers flagged cases of rapid withdrawal. Families expressed concern, often too late. The collapse of a single weekly gathering had revealed how fragile the safety net truly was. Meetings were held at higher levels now. Officials spoke of resources, of programs, of intervention strategies. But the language felt distant, impersonal. It addressed symptoms without acknowledging the emotional wound at the center of it all. What people wanted was acknowledgement. What they received were procedures. As Thanksgiving approached, the isolation deepened. Holidays, once softened by communal rituals, now highlighted absence. Empty chairs felt louder. Unused bingo cards sat tucked away in drawers, like artifacts from a vanished life. Martha spent Thanksgiving alone. She prepared a small meal out of habit rather than hunger. She set the table for one, then hesitated, staring at the empty space across from her. She ate in silence, tears welling unexpectedly, not from sadness alone, but from the crushing realization that no one would notice if she disappeared from the world entirely. That thought frightened her, not because she believed it was true, but because it felt true. Harold spent the day making phone calls, most of which went unanswered. Each unanswered call reinforced his belief that people had chosen comfort over truth. His voice grew sharper, his words more absolute. Evelyn and Ruth avoided the holiday altogether, retreating into routine as if it were protection. And throughout the city, conversations grew more polarized. People chose sides without fully understanding what those sides represented. Silence was interpreted as guilt, hesitation as deception. Attempts at nuance were dismissed as excuses. The story had taken on a life of its own. It no longer required facts to sustain it. It required belief. By early December, the emotional pressure reached a critical mass. People were no longer simply reacting to events. They were acting on conclusions formed in isolation. Decisions were made privately, without discussion, without oversight. Each person justified their actions internally, convinced they were restoring balance, dignity, or truth. No one believed they were doing harm. They believed they were correcting it. This was the most dangerous stage, when exhaustion masquerades as clarity, when fear dresses itself as resolve, when people act not out of cruelty, but out of the desperate need to feel seen again. Lexington stood at the edge of that moment. The hall behind the church remained dark most nights, its windows reflecting nothing but streetlights and shadows. And inside the lives of those who had once gathered there, something irreversible had begun. The coming weeks would not bring answers, they would bring consequences. December arrived without snow, but the cold felt heavier than in any previous year. Lexington moved through its days as if under a low grey ceiling. The absence of light was not dramatic, not storm-driven, but persistent. Mornings were dim, afternoons faded quickly, nights stretched longer than they should have. The season magnified what had already been breaking for months. For the elderly who had once depended on the rhythm of bingo night, December stripped away the last illusion of normalcy. Martha Caldwell woke one morning convinced it was Thursday. She dressed carefully, slower than usual, choosing the coat she always wore to the hall. She paused in the hallway, purse in hand, waiting for the familiar sense of anticipation to arrive. It didn't. Instead, confusion settled in. She checked the calendar. Monday. She sat down on the edge of her bed and cried quietly, ashamed of herself, angry at her own mind. The realization that her sense of time was dissolving frightened her more than loneliness ever had. She stayed home that day, barely moving. Harold Bennett, meanwhile, felt energized in a way that alarmed even him. The weeks of tension, rumors, and unresolved anger had crystallized into certainty. In his mind, everything now made sense. The silence, the avoidance, the lack of accountability, all of it confirmed what he believed. He no longer questioned whether harm had been done. He believed harm had been allowed. That belief gave him clarity. He spoke with conviction, no longer hedging his words. He repeated the story so often that it hardened into truth for him. The narrative became simple. People in power had chosen convenience over honesty, and people like him had been sacrificed quietly. That belief insulated him from doubt. Evelyn Moore watched her sister unravel. Ruth barely slept. She startled easily, interpreted harmless events as threats, and clung to Evelyn as if separation itself were dangerous. Evelyn tried to anchor them both, but her own reserves were depleted. She felt herself thinning, patience wearing down, compassion turning brittle. Their apartment felt smaller every day. Daniel Price reached a point of emotional paralysis. The pressure had become unbearable. Every glance felt accusatory. Every silence felt loaded. He no longer knew whether defending himself would worsen things or whether his continued silence was already doing irreparable harm. He considered stepping forward publicly, then imagined the looks, the skepticism, the disbelief. He stayed silent. The hall behind the church remained mostly closed, but its presence haunted the neighborhood. People walked past it more slowly now. Some avoided looking at it altogether. It had become a symbol, not of what happened, but of what was never resolved. As Christmas approached, the emotional toll reached its peak. Holiday decorations went up unevenly. Some houses were brightly lit, trying desperately to reclaim cheer. Others remained dark. The contrast felt sharp, almost cruel. Martha received fewer calls than usual. People assumed she was busy with family. She wasn't. She spent hours sitting by the window, watching lights turn on and off in other houses, wondering how she had become invisible so quietly. She began to experience moments of disorientation more frequently. Once, she left the stove on and didn't realize it until the smell startled her. Another time she couldn't remember where she had placed her keys and accused herself aloud, as if scolding a child. She did not ask for help. Asking would have meant admitting that the world she relied on had vanished. Harold's fixation intensified. He began showing up at places connected to the hall, the church office, community centers, meetings he wasn't invited to. His presence made people uncomfortable. His certainty felt contagious and dangerous. Some listened, others withdrew. Each reaction reinforced his belief that people were afraid of the truth. Evelyn noticed Ruth growing more withdrawn, more brittle. Conversations turned into arguments more often. Evelyn felt herself losing the ability to reassure her sister convincingly. "Nothing has happened," she said one night. Ruth replied quietly, "That's the problem." Daniel, isolated and exhausted, stopped answering calls altogether. He felt trapped between accusation and silence, unable to move without causing damage. The weight of perceived guilt pressed down on him constantly, even in sleep. He began waking with his heart racing, his mind replaying imagined confrontations that never came. The community, meanwhile, fractured further. People chose interpretations that matched their fears. Some believed the situation was being exaggerated. Others believed it was being deliberately buried. Few believed it would ever be resolved. That belief, that nothing would be made right, changed behavior. People stopped waiting. They began acting on assumptions, not violently, not dramatically. Quietly, individually, each person convinced themselves they were responding to reality rather than contributing to it. On a cold evening shortly before Christmas, a small group gathered near the hall. Not formally, not announced. They stood outside longer than necessary, speaking in low voices, sharing grievances that had fermented for months. The conversation was not aggressive, but it was charged. Each story layered upon the next, reinforcing the sense that something unforgivable had been allowed to stand. No one suggested harm. No one intended catastrophe. They believed they were reclaiming dignity. Elsewhere, Martha sat alone in her living room, the television flickering without sound. Harold drove aimlessly through dark streets. Evelyn lay awake, listening to Ruth's uneven breathing. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, staring at nothing. None of them knew that the accumulation of silent decisions, private convictions, and unresolved resentment had reached a point where outcomes could no longer be controlled. Tragedy, when it comes this way, does not arrive as an explosion. It arrives as a convergence of isolation, of fear, of people acting alone, convinced they are doing what must be done. Lexington crossed that threshold quietly, and when the night finally ended, the community would wake to a reality none of them had intended, one shaped not by malice, but by everything that had been left unsaid for far too long. The morning Lexington awoke to after that night did not announce itself with sirens or chaos. There were no helicopters circling overhead, no crowds rushing through the streets, no immediate spectacle to signal that something fundamental had broken. The sky was a pale, undecided grey, the kind that often followed long winter nights. Frost clung lightly to car windshields, porch lights flicked off one by one as people began their day. For a brief, fragile moment, it seemed possible that the city might continue forward untouched. That illusion dissolved quietly. The first calls were made early, voices low and careful, as if speaking too loudly might shatter something already cracked. Words were chosen slowly, sentences broke in half. Explanations came with long pauses, not because people didn't know what to say, but because saying it felt unreal. 11 people were gone, not injured, not hospitalized, gone. The number moved through Lexington with a strange weight, heavy and disorienting. 11 was not abstract, it was not distant. It was a number large enough to feel collective, but small enough that each loss could be named, pictured, remembered. By mid-morning, the truth had settled into the city like cold air slipping under doors. The community hall behind the church became the axis around which everything turned. Police vehicles lined the curb in quiet formation. Yellow tape framed the entrance, its brightness clashing painfully with the dull brick walls that had once welcomed people inside. The door remained closed, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Neighbors gathered nearby, standing farther apart than usual. Some folded their arms tightly, others pressed hands to their mouths. No one spoke loudly. No one needed to. They all understood. Inside homes across Lexington, the news landed differently. Martha Caldwell's phone rang just after 8. She had been sitting at her kitchen table, staring at her calendar without really seeing it. Thursday still had bingo written in careful, aging handwriting, circled lightly as if to emphasize its importance. She had not crossed it out. She had never crossed it out. When she answered the phone, she listened without interrupting. The voice on the other end struggled to find words that wouldn't sound cruel. It spoke of an incident, of people she knew, of a number that felt wrong the moment it was said. Martha said nothing. When the call ended, she remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The kitchen felt unnaturally quiet, as if sound itself had retreated out of respect. Her eyes drifted slowly across the room, the chair where she usually sat during breakfast, the counter cluttered with notes she had written to herself, the window that looked out onto a street that suddenly felt very far away. She did not cry at first. Instead, she felt something colder than sadness. Regret. Regret for the nights she had stayed home, the conversations she had postponed, the faces she had assumed she would see again, for believing that time, somehow, would always wait. The thought settled heavily. Some of the people she had known for years had left this world without knowing she still thought of them. That realization hurt more than the news itself. Harold Bennett learned the truth while driving. He was stopped at a red light when the call came in. At first, he misunderstood. He asked the person to repeat themselves. When the number was said again, 11, his chest tightened violently. He pulled the car over without fully realizing what he was doing. The certainty that had fueled him for months, the belief that he had been fighting for dignity, for truth, shattered instantly. His narrative collapsed under the weight of consequence. This was not vindication. This was devastation. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel and shook. For the first time in a long while, Harold felt the full force of doubt. Not about what had happened at the hall, but about himself. About the words he had spoken, the intensity he had encouraged, the way he had allowed anger to masquerade as clarity. Nothing he had believed prepared him for this. Evelyn and Ruth Moore heard together. Evelyn answered the phone. Ruth watched her face change, color draining, eyes widening slightly before closing altogether. When the call ended, Evelyn dropped the phone and it hit the floor with a soft final sound. Ruth sat down slowly, as if gravity itself had increased. For several seconds, neither sister spoke. Then Ruth began to cry. Not the controlled, quiet tears Evelyn had grown used to, but deep, gasping sobs that came from somewhere unguarded. Evelyn held her, pressing her sister's face into her shoulder, feeling her own composure crack under the weight of shared grief. They cried for the people lost. They cried for the months that had led here. They cried for the silence that had seemed safer than confrontation, only to prove catastrophic. Daniel Price was already awake when authorities arrived at his door. He did not resist. He did not argue. He did not ask to explain himself. His face looked older than it had weeks earlier, hollowed by exhaustion and regret. When questioned, he answered plainly. When silence followed, he accepted it. He understood something now that he had avoided for too long. Silence is not neutral. It does not preserve peace. It shapes outcomes. As the day unfolded, Lexington began to change in visible ways. Shops closed early without explanation. Church doors opened and remained open, candles lit inside. People stood in small groups on sidewalks, speaking in murmurs, exchanging fragments of information that all led back to the same unbearable truth. 11 lives had ended in a place built for comfort. The weight of that contradiction pressed down on the city. By evening, the names began to circulate. Each name carried history, decades of living, of loving, of surviving quietly. Reading them felt invasive and intimate at the same time. Obituaries were drafted hastily, families struggling to compress entire lifetimes into a few paragraphs. The repetition was overwhelming. Grandmother, widower, retired teacher, former mechanic, church volunteer, neighbor. Lives that had never sought attention now filled the city's consciousness. Vigils were organized quickly. People gathered outside the church, candles flickering in the cold air. The light reflected off faces marked by grief, confusion, and disbelief. Names were read aloud slowly, deliberately, each one followed by silence. With every name, something inside the crowd tightened. Martha attended the first vigil, leaning heavily on her cane, supported by neighbors she barely knew before this tragedy pulled them together. She listened to the names and felt them echo inside her chest. When one of the organizers invited anyone who wished to speak forward, she surprised herself by stepping ahead. Her voice was soft but steady. "They came because they wanted to belong," she said. "That's all any of us wanted." There was no applause, only understanding. Harold stood at the edge of the crowd, unable to bring himself closer. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped. The man who had once filled rooms with certainty now felt small, uncertain, painfully aware of the power words carry when left unchecked. Evelyn and Ruth stood hand in hand, their grief mirrored in each other's eyes. For the first time in months, Ruth's fear softened into sorrow. Grief that finally had direction, grief that no longer needed to imagine threats where none existed. Daniel did not attend the vigils. He watched from a distance, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His future would be decided elsewhere, but his internal reckoning had already begun. He would carry this night with him forever, not as a villain in his own mind, but as a man who failed to understand how fragile trust truly is. In the days that followed, Lexington entered a period of collective mourning unlike anything it had experienced before. Funerals overlapped, church bells rang repeatedly. Cars lined streets near cemeteries, their engines idling as families waited quietly for services to begin. People who had never met the victims attended anyway, drawn by a sense that this loss belonged to everyone now. The community hall remained closed. No one asked when it would reopen. The building had become something else entirely, a symbol not just of tragedy, but of everything that had been allowed to decay slowly, unnoticed. Families gathered afterward in living rooms and kitchens, sharing stories, trying to understand how a space meant for connection had become the setting for irreversible loss. Conversations turned inward, uncomfortable, necessary. How many times had they assumed someone else would check in? How often had silence felt easier than asking hard questions? How many small warnings had been ignored because acknowledging them would have required discomfort? Lexington had no simple answers. Only accountability. In the weeks that followed, Lexington learned a new rhythm, one shaped not by routine but by absence. The city moved more slowly, as if every step required consideration. Conversations hesitated before beginning. People spoke more softly, even in places where laughter had once been loud. The tragedy did not explode outward. It sank inward, settling into homes, into habits, into the spaces where certainty had once lived. Funerals blurred together. Churches struggled to accommodate the number of services requested. Families coordinated schedules carefully, making room for one another's grief. The same hymns were sung again and again, their words growing heavier with repetition. Each service followed a similar pattern, yet each loss felt entirely singular. At every gathering, faces repeated, neighbors, former bingo players, volunteers, people who had never spoken before now recognizing one another through shared sorrow. Grief, it seemed, had become the city's most common language. Martha Caldwell attended as many services as her body would allow. She sat in the same pew each time, hands folded tightly in her lap, listening as lives were summarized in careful words. She recognized details others might have missed, a laugh described too briefly, a habit mentioned only in passing. She remembered the way those people had marked their bingo cards, how they drank their coffee, how they leaned forward when they were close to winning. She carried those details with her like something sacred. At home, Martha began leaving her lights on longer at night, not out of fear, but out of a quiet defiance against invisibility. She called people she hadn't spoken to in months. Sometimes the conversations were awkward, sometimes they were brief. But she refused to retreat entirely into silence again. She understood now how dangerous that silence could be. Harold Bennett did not attend every funeral. Some days he could not bring himself to leave the house. On others, he stood in the back of the church, his presence heavy with unspoken remorse. He listened to eulogies with his jaw clenched, each story reminding him of the weight words can carry when repeated often enough. He replayed conversations endlessly, not just his own, but those of others who had fed into the same shared frustration. He realized how certainty had given him comfort, how believing he was right had numbed him to complexity. Now, certainty felt like a threat. For the first time in months, Harold stopped speaking publicly about what he believed had happened. When people approached him, expecting outrage or validation, he redirected the conversation toward remembrance instead. "It doesn't matter what we think anymore," he said once quietly. "What matters is who we lost." The shift did not absolve him, but it marked the beginning of accountability. Evelyn and Ruth Moore experienced grief differently. Ruth's sorrow softened her vigilance, but it did not erase it. She cried often, openly now, releasing months of bottled fear. Evelyn watched her sister carefully, relieved to see emotion replace anxiety, yet deeply aware of how close they had come to losing one another emotionally as well. They attended counseling together, something neither would have considered before. They spoke about trust, about fear, about how easily isolation had fed their worst assumptions. The conversations were painful, but necessary. For Evelyn, the tragedy clarified something she could no longer ignore. Connection must be maintained intentionally, especially when it becomes uncomfortable. Daniel Price existed in a state of suspended time. The investigation moved slowly, methodically, its focus careful and restrained. Authorities spoke cautiously, emphasizing responsibility rather than blame, context rather than spectacle. Daniel cooperated fully, answering questions, revisiting decisions, reliving moments he wished desperately to forget. At night, he lay awake, replaying not just the night itself, but every missed opportunity to intervene sooner, to speak more clearly, to acknowledge concerns instead of deflecting them. He understood now that leadership is not defined by control, but by attentiveness, and attentiveness, once neglected, carries a terrible cost. Across Lexington, conversations began to change. People spoke more openly about aging, about loneliness, about how quickly independence can turn into isolation. Social workers, clergy, and community leaders held forums, not to assign blame, but to listen. Attendance was higher than anyone expected. Stories poured out. People spoke of routine eroding quietly, of spaces closing without notice, of feeling invisible long before tragedy struck. The shared realization was sobering. The bingo hall had not been the problem. It had been the last fragile solution. When it disappeared, nothing had replaced it. The city began to respond. Senior outreach programs expanded rapidly. Volunteers were trained to recognize signs of isolation. Check-in systems were implemented, not as surveillance, but as care. Churches coordinated schedules to ensure regular contact with those who lived alone. Neighbors were encouraged, gently, persistently, to notice absences. These changes did not erase grief, but they honored it. Memorials were placed discreetly around the city. Benches installed, plaques mounted quietly, without ceremony. The names were engraved simply, without embellishment. Visitors often stopped running their fingers over the letters, grounding abstract loss in something tangible. The community hall remained untouched. Some argued it should be reopened, transformed into something new. Others believed it should remain closed indefinitely. The debate was respectful, but unresolved. The building had become a shared wound. Reopening it too quickly felt dismissive. Leaving it abandoned felt like surrender. Time, it seemed, would have to decide. Martha visited the hall once during this period. She stood across the street, leaning on her cane, watching the building in silence. She did not approach the door. She did not need to. The memories lived in her already, the hum of fluorescent lights, the sound of chairs scraping, the quiet thrill of anticipation. She whispered a few names, then she turned and walked away. Harold began volunteering quietly, not in leadership roles, not in places of authority. He helped with transportation, with setting up chairs, with errands that required little explanation. He listened more than he spoke. When people mentioned the tragedy, he did not deflect, but he did not speculate either. His presence changed subtly. People noticed. Evelyn and Ruth found themselves becoming advocates. They spoke publicly about isolation, about the dangers of unaddressed fear, about how quickly trust can erode when people stop listening. Their voices were calm, grounded, shaped by lived experience rather than outrage. Daniel withdrew from public life almost entirely. When asked for statements, he declined. He believed words had already done enough. Instead, he focused on understanding how silence had shaped events, how the absence of acknowledgement had created space for resentment to grow unchecked. He accepted responsibility, without spectacle. And slowly, Lexington began to breathe again. Not fully, not easily, but intentionally. The city learned that tragedy does not always arrive violently. Sometimes it arrives patiently, accumulating through neglect, through avoidance, through the belief that discomfort is worse than confrontation. That lesson lingered. Winter returned to Lexington slowly, without urgency. Snow came late that year, light at first, then steadier, softening edges that had felt too sharp for months. Streets quieted earlier in the evenings. Footsteps sounded muffled. The city seemed to exhale beneath the weight of white, as if nature itself were offering a pause, not forgiveness but stillness. Time passed, but it did not erase what had happened. It reshaped it. The tragedy no longer lived only in shock or disbelief. It had settled into something more complex, memory. And memory, unlike headlines, does not fade quickly. It lingers in habits, in changed behaviors, in the way people approach one another with more care than before. Martha Caldwell felt that change most clearly in herself. She had not returned to the community hall, and she knew she never would. Yet she no longer felt defined by its absence. Her days, once unstructured and heavy, slowly regained shape, not through replacement but through intention. She began attending a small weekly gathering organized by neighbors. Nothing formal, no games, no prizes, just coffee, conversation, and the shared understanding that presence mattered. Martha arrived early, as she always had, choosing a seat where she could see everyone. Watching people still grounded her. But now she spoke more. She told stories she had once assumed no one wanted to hear. She laughed without apologizing for the sound. She asked questions and waited for answers. She understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, that being seen required allowing oneself to be known. On Thursdays, she no longer circled the calendar. Instead, she left the square blank, not out of forgetting, but out of respect. Harold Bennett changed in quieter ways. He no longer sought certainty. He no longer needed to be right. He learned to sit with ambiguity, with discomfort, with the knowledge that intentions do not protect outcomes. The work he did now, the small, uncelebrated acts of service, grounded him, driving someone to an appointment, carrying groceries, sitting beside someone who didn't want to be alone. In those moments, Harold felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Useful, not powerful, not righteous, just present. Evelyn and Ruth Moore continued forward together. Their relationship, strained and brittle for so long, had softened through shared grief and honest conversation. They no longer avoided difficult topics. Fear still surfaced. It always would. But it no longer controlled their lives. They had learned that vigilance without connection becomes isolation, and isolation breeds distortion. They chose connection instead. Daniel Price faded from the city's daily awareness, not because he was forgotten, but because attention shifted where it belonged, toward care, prevention, and responsibility. His absence was quiet, intentional. He did not seek redemption through explanation. He accepted that some consequences could not be undone, only carried. In time, Lexington stopped asking about him. The focus moved forward. The community hall remained closed through winter. Snow gathered on its steps, untouched. Icicles formed along the roofline, shimmering briefly in weak sunlight before melting away. Some days people paused as they passed it, other days they didn't. The building had become part of the city's emotional geography, a landmark of loss, yes, but also of learning. Discussions about its future continued. Some proposed transforming it into a memorial space. Others suggested a center focused on outreach and connection, explicitly designed to prevent the kind of isolation that had led here. No decision felt urgent. Rushing, after all, had taught them nothing good. On the anniversary of the tragedy, Lexington gathered again. Not in the hall, in a park nearby. The ceremony was simple, no speeches, no cameras, just names read aloud, followed by silence. Families stood together. Neighbors stood beside them. Strangers stood too, drawn by the shared understanding that this story belonged to all of them now. When the last name was spoken, no one moved right away. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was intentional. Martha stood near the back, her cane planted firmly in the ground. She listened to the quiet and felt something unfamiliar but welcome settle inside her. Peace. not because the loss had lessened, but because it had been acknowledged. As people began to disperse, conversations started naturally, softly, carefully. There was no pressure to fill the silence, only the freedom to break it if needed. Children ran nearby, unaware of the weight carried by the adults around them. Life, inevitably, continued. That evening, Martha returned home and sat by her window as the sun faded. The streetlights flicked on one by one, just as they always had. She watched people pass, some alone, some together, and felt connected to them in a way she hadn't before. She thought about how easily belonging can be lost, and how intentionally it must be protected. Across the city, others reached similar conclusions in their own ways. Neighbors knocked on doors more often. Conversations extended beyond pleasantries. Absences were noticed and questioned gently. Silence was no longer assumed to be harmless. Lexington did not become perfect, but it became aware. And awareness, while painful, is a form of responsibility. Months later, as spring approached once again, the snow melted quietly from sidewalks and rooftops. Green returned to trees, windows opened. The city stretched, cautious but alive. The hall behind the church still stood. One morning, Martha walked past it slowly. She paused, placed her hand briefly against the brick, and then, without looking back, continued down the sidewalk. The story of the bingo night would be told many ways in the years to come. Some would focus on causes, others on consequences. Some would search for villains, others for lessons. But for those who lived through it, the truth was simpler and far heavier. It was a story about people who wanted to belong, about what happens when belonging is treated as optional, about how silence, when left unchallenged, can do as much harm as any deliberate act, and about the responsibility communities carry, not just to remember the dead, but to protect the living. This was the night the bingo stopped, and the moment Lexington learned that connection is not a luxury. It is a necessity,